All right, so we're here to talk about IP routing for 30 minutes. And this is going to be a good one because we actually have one company that has made the leap and one company that has not made the leap. So maybe you guys can ask questions of each other. You can talk longingly of baseband and SDI.
Good old days.
The good old days. And then Peter can discuss the challenges of moving to IP. So the previous discussion, we heard the word data, 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 data over again. And one thing that came up was if you're not comfortable with conceiving of a video signal as data, then you may have issues going forward with your career. So I guess when you look at IP routing, that is the key question, right? Is making that leap from looking at your video signals as, I guess, baseband and video signals and SDI, and then turning them into data. So, Jason, I know a few years back when we discussed the move to IP, at first, I think the first year you were kind of like, well, this is really about the big shows and doing the US Open for Fox and what have you. And then your tone changed pretty quickly, probably within 8 months or so, 9 months later, you kind of said, this is sort of the way it's going to be for everything, not just for the big shows. So walk us through your transition to IP routing, where you are now, and let's start with the simple one.
Sure.
The transition, how did it kind of start, and where are you now?
Well, we started with our first truck, Encore. Was it 3 years ago now? 3 years ago. We were given a set of requirements by Fox that we had to hit in terms of capability for this new truck system we were putting together for NFL and US Open Golf. And we looked at it every way we could with a traditional baseband routing system, both with one frame and with two. And we just could not get to where we needed to go. And we went back to our vendor and said, we're looking for a new solution. And we wound up with an IP router in our truck. Surprise, surprise. So we didn't go into it intending to do that. That was not our goal, not our intent to be front runners in this at all. But that's where we wound up. We had to do it to hit these numbers, and we wound up building Encore that really exceeded everyone's expectations. And it's a good thing we did, because pretty much the second it hit the road, the client Fox basically ran that infrastructure right out to the end, even having promised that they would only utilize it about 50% of what we built. So had we not done that, we'd really be in big trouble today.
So you went with Evertz, right?
We did.
Joe, again, good job.
Good sales job, Joe.
Huh? So as far as the, now, what have you learned since then? So you had the initial one. Should I ask you about the hiccups and the learning then, or have things changed, and are the systems more intuitive now at this point and more mature?
Well, one thing I would say, just sort of reacting to what you were speaking about a minute ago about the big data, we certainly weren't looking at it that way then, and maybe not even so much now. Basically the IP routers we're deploying in Encore, and then the next one we did in Yogi, are almost we're almost simulating a big cross-point baseband router. We wrap the whole thing around IP gateways, and everything that touches it is SDI, and everything that leaves it ultimately is SDI. For our second one, Yogi, which we put on the road in the spring for the S network, we did approach it a little differently and imagined a future where we would be native IP with edge devices, 2110 perhaps, and allowed ourselves the possibility to think about removing all that gateway hardware when we maybe have a native 2110 switcher, a native 2110 replay device, a native 2110 camera. And now with the new truck we're going to put on the road in February, again, we're thinking that way and really imagining a 2110 future where we have all native IP edge devices. Even though today it's full of IP gateways, because we really have no choice but to do it that way.
So maybe just in case there are people who don't know the whole gateway situation, can you kind of walk through it a little bit and what the difficulties are there?
Sure. Well, an IP gateway is simply a device that takes baseband SDI video and turns it into bits and 10 gig Ethernet, which can flow into our switch core, which in this case is an Evertz EXE router or EXE switch. And conversely does the opposite, takes the bits and turns it back into SDI, so that our EVSs and our switchers and our cameras, we can get that video in and out of the infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. So walk me through the learning curve, because I remember going to see the truck. One of the things was, one of the interesting things was not realizing that in the IP world, if there's a problem with the crosspoint or what have you, it's a block of crosspoints that kind of have to be taken offline as opposed to just dealing with things on a one-to-one basis. But what's some of the those early challenges that you found as far as maintenance of an IP router versus a...
Well, the learning curve was vertical, and we learned as we went, and I think too, our vendor at Evertz was learning right along with us. You know, they were deploying it in a truck for the first time, and we were demanding things, you know, of the system that, you know, we wanted it to behave like a regular cross-point router, and some of the realities of how a cross-point router works didn't translate perfectly in the early going to how an IP router looks at the world. So we had a lot of, you know, a lot of trouble. I don't want to say trouble, but you know, some of the challenges in the early going were fast switching. You know, if you're in video and you're sitting there hammering between two sources, just getting that switch to occur quickly enough. That was one of the early challenges. Just getting a piece of video to route from one place to another, you know, once, no problem. But when you actually need it to be responsive to the user sitting in front of it, that was really the first tricky part we had. And Evertz solved that stuff pretty quickly, and we went out the door. And our goal was that the operators sitting in the truck and running in video and in replay, you know, they were unaware, ideally, that they were even operating an IP infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. So has your attitude, so again, like I said early on, you thought it was just for the big trucks. Now, do you still feel that way? How do you see it falling down for smaller shows, if you will, and smaller trucks?
Well, we haven't built a big truck since, well, we did 2 last summer, which were sort of, in my mind, the end of the line for big SDI trucks. The thing that's pushing us over the cliff at the moment is the possibility of 4K in these infrastructures, and just the size even those shows are going to. Yogi was built, of course, to service Yes Network, dual feed, and also do the World Series. 79 is built to do the biggest of the big ESPN shows, so it also needed to be IP. We haven't since then had an opportunity to build a smaller truck, although we recently did crunch the numbers on putting an IP router in our new Edit truck, and I think what we concluded there was that the cost bump was too extreme to do it. So we'll probably stick with SDI for that small project. But we're looking to a future where I think the thing that really bumps that cost up is the IP gateway piece of it. So when that part can go away and we have some native connectivity, I think that the smaller infrastructures will look really good in IP.
Right. So Peter, obviously Mobile TV Group, you know, at a different, like a lot of obviously regional RSN shows and things like that. Big believers in 4K, jumped into that.
Yep.
So what's the internal discussions with respects to IP routing, and when you talk to the vendors, who probably say, when are you guys going to go to IP? But what's sort of the current take on IP and why it's not a fit at this point?
Well, we've been looking at it for a couple of years now, and there's no doubt in our minds that this is the way it's going to go. However, as Jason brought up, the IP gateways are the hurdle that we have to get over right now. That they drive up the cost of a router considerably. We're 50 to 60% higher than what we're doing in baseband right now, and that's a cost that we know in the future is going to go away. So it's hard for us to take on that cost. When we build a truck, we look to at least get 6-7 years out of it before we have to reinvest into it. And I believe the gateways were probably within a couple of years of those going away. So the investment doesn't make sense for us right now, mainly on the gateways. And that's on our typical regional HD truck, because we don't have the need. I think, I'm an engineer, I really love the new technology and I get into it, but there needs to be a reason to go to it. And we haven't found that reason to go to IP routing quite yet. We could definitely see the benefits of it when doing the UHD, because we are up against the baseband router size on UHD. So we're seeing the benefits, just not quite there yet.
And is it also because the size of the shows, for the most part, camera complements, replays, can kind of work within that quad environment without kind of
They can, yeah. We're right up against it using quad link. Now that we've been successful with UHD and doing, regional to national levels in UHD, now they're like, okay, it's working, we just want a little bit more, and we want a little bit more, and a little bit more, and now they're getting back up to the production that they expect in HD, So that's putting us right up against the limits of baseband. So I can definitely see the benefits of IP routing with baseband. We just want all manufacturers to can talk the same language and just plug it in and it work.
Right.
So
Completely little sidebar. So what about 12 gig? 12 gig. Is that anywhere in the equation for you guys or for you at all? Or?
It's not in the equation for us, and really, 12 gig would have been nice to have, but we didn't see a vendor come forward with a product that really took advantage of 12 gig in any at-scale way. So it never became practical for us.
yeah, we were big proponents of 12G because we saw it as a stepping stone to IP, but unfortunately it just didn't. It didn't take off. Not enough vendors got involved with it, mainly on the routing side of things. Because with 12G routing, we wanted to see the same functionality as we would get on a typical baseband router, a 3G router. And while they did the 12G part of it really well, we ran into a lot of audio issues. They didn't have the audio functionality that we would expect. So that's really what stopped us from doing it.
And I think we also sort of came to the conclusion on our side that since we were in IP anyway, a 12 gig router looks a lot like an IP router to us. So
Right.
We were sort of already there.
Right. So it's interesting because you mentioned the, and it's neat that it kind of replicates a lot of the workflows of a baseband router, but it's got the IP guts, right? But to me, in a weird way, that's sort of, and you kind of heard this talking this morning at the IP about the working in the abstract of how IP can change everything as far as graphics and yada yada yada. But it seems like in a way you're sort of taking a Porsche engine and putting into a Honda Civic, and then not being able to drive it at the right speeds, but everyone's comfortable because it feels like Dad's car.
I don't disagree with you there. Like I said, it was all about capacity for us. We were certainly not taking advantage of anything or most of the things that IP promises, and even now we're not. But I see with the publication finally of 2110, I see we're really setting sail in that direction. So I'm excited about that.
Well, and the conversation this morning, because it was interesting, because if you weren't there, there was the discussion about how no one's really taking advantage of understands the potential of this whole IP world and the way when you can separate the video and the audio and the metadata and the essences and the way you can play with signals in a different way. But it seems like when you start to think about the freedom that gives you, it almost could be overwhelming as far as and you have to really have to work closely with your clients as far as what they're going to want to do with it. It's not as simple as you just putting it in and saying, hey, guess what, Fox? Now you can do all. It's going to be a very interesting conversation when that actually happens.
It's going to be very interesting. And the other thing I think that's going to start to blow people's minds is when we start to talk about Converge Networks. And right now we have an audio-video infrastructure that's separate from our intercom infrastructure, that's separate from our audio board infrastructure, and separate from command and control. And one thing we can think about now is putting a switch at the center of this that handles all of it. There's no reason to think about it as separate islands any longer.
Yeah, I think we understand really well the possibilities of IP and the promises. We just want it to be delivered, right? So it all can talk together. So we can just plug it in, and all of a sudden, the switcher's talking to the router, and it's talking the same language, and we don't need a converter box in the middle of it. And I'm really excited about that with seeing the sessions this morning and what's been promised, and we're getting so close, and so hopefully soon.
And if it was cheaper, you probably would be considering it now. But now, because this is a 50% premium.
I think so. I think we had 2022-6. I don't think we believed it was going to go that direction, so we were waiting that out initially because we knew 2110 was coming. Now that 2110's here, now the focus is more on trying to lower the cost and get rid of the gateways to make it the same cost of what we're paying today. Because the clients are not going to pay more just because it's IP routing versus baseband. They don't, router, they don't, that's the nuts and bolts of it that they don't get involved in. Right. So we can't go and say, hey, we're an IP router. We have an IP router now. We want to charge you more for that. They'll be like, no way.
Right.
So.
No, you're exactly right about that. Nobody really cares that it's an IP router, only that you're able to achieve the sort of infrastructure scale that is implied, and that's really why we're doing it. There's no good reason at the moment to do for any other way.
Right. So this morning, obviously, Media 180 gave a little presentation about training. So what did you do internally to kind of get your engineers, other than throwing them in the deep end of the pool?
We pretty much threw them in the deep end of the pool and hung on for the ride, and we're still sort of there.
Did you lose anybody?
No. Well, Keith sitting down there, I think he tapped out, and he came to work with me in the office instead of being on the road.
That's right. And Kevin Callahan tapped out, and Brad Cheney tapped out.
But one of the things we worry about as we go forward is, it is a huge steep learning curve, and we put it in front of our best and brightest engineers, to take it out the door. And now as we're thinking about applying it sort of globally to our infrastructure, we need to make sure that every one of our engineers is capable of understanding it and operating it and troubleshooting it when it breaks. And that's a huge challenge. And to your question, the Media 180 thing this morning was eye-opening and something that we've thought a lot about. How do we, give that knowledge to our engineers and make sure that they're equipped to really take care of business on our trucks?
Now, do you find yourself looking for, if there's new hires, are you looking for that IP skill set? Is that
Totally.
an advantage?
Absolutely. Today what we try to do is we try to put a nice combination of old school and new school on the trucks. That's the old school skill set is becoming really tough to come by. The new school skill set is even difficult as well, as applied to a broadcast kind of context. So we're basically having to train them ourselves to do what to give them the skills that they need to do.
But do you do like the Cisco certification? Have you done that?
We've been looking at the Cisco certification, but it's not actually, we're not using any Cisco hardware in our IP routing at the moment. So it's not that it's irrelevant, but that's not the hardware we're deploying. So what we do is we have training sessions with everts, and to a large degree too, the IP portion of it is a little bit of a black box. So we're learning as we go.
Yeah, I think the Cisco's a little bit overkill. We've had a few of our guys do it, but it's still you're taking a class that's for networking. It's not for video over IP. And while they get a lot out of it, having something tailored to exactly what we do is tough to find. And especially with when we've got 60 engineers across the country and they all have different experience levels, and you bring them into this, some of them are like, oh yeah, I get it. I sit down, they get the concepts, and off they go. Other guys need a lot of, doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it, and then they finally understand it. So I think training is a huge, I don't want to say it's a problem, but it's a hurdle. It's a huge hurdle that we're going to have in the future, especially if it takes off quickly.
So will 2110 and this whole discussion of, quote unquote plug and play, will that make things easier, you think, as far as this transition?
I hope so. That's the promise. We want to basically just have a single wire. You take your EVS and you plug it into your switch, and have a nice day. That's how it ought to be. Whether or not that actually comes to pass, at least in the short term, remains to be seen. That's what we're excited about. Get rid of the gateway and hopefully all the complexity of managing all the IP streams by hand, essentially.
So Peter?
Oh, yeah, I hope we get to that. And
skeptical.
A little bit. The thing we look at too, because we've to kind of get our engineers into IP, we've really, as far as the networking of all the devices on the truck, we've started giving training on that, because that has gotten more complicated also, not necessarily video, but all the data that's moving around the truck for like a media network and intercom and switcher and all that. And what we found on that is that when it's working, it works great. But when something goes wrong, this different set of troubleshooting skills you need, they're completely different than what we have today. So while they're saying, yep, it's plug and play, but when it goes wrong, what do we do? Where do we start? And we have a lot of engineers, the last few trucks we've built, where the networking has gotten so complicated, something does go wrong, they don't know what to do. So, and that's where, again, back to the training, we need to train.
Yeah, you do need to start with the basic troubleshooting skills. Is it plugged in? Is the little light on? But once you've sort of established that all the links are in place, then it becomes a question of what's going on inside the black box, and that's really what's really difficult to get your arms around. and to train for. So that's kind of the stage we're at now, is trying to figure out how to do that.
Right. I think, like I said, that the open, it was the understanding that you had to take like a whole block of devices offline, maybe to deal with solving a problem because of the way the boards are configured, and not that I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, there's, you know, the EXE switch is a lot like a baseband router in that it's, you know, divvied up into chunks, and if there are parts of it that can fail and take a piece of your infrastructure offline. So if you need to troubleshoot that, you have to, you know, do it carefully and at times that don't disrupt, you know, the whole show.
Well, I expect our troubleshooting tools to get better too, right? So, you know, I think right now, you know, there's a lot of focus on how to get the IP to work. And then I think after that, hopefully the manufacturers will follow up with more troubleshooting feedback, right? So, you know, this needs to talk to this, and, you know, give us feedback. Why isn't it talking? And more probably in more layman's terms than what it is now. So we don't need to have somebody with Cisco certification on staff, or to analyze the logs, or, you know, to figure out what's going wrong.
Well, there's also too, you know, speaking of logs, there's a huge amount of data that comes out of these systems, and you need, you know, the skills to read through it, or you need a vendor sitting beside you to read it. The tools for troubleshooting and monitoring these systems are getting better every day. When we put Encore on the road, we basically had no visibility on what devices were linked to other devices, you know, within the switch. But Evertz is now deploying tools that are making that a lot better, and we expect that to improve as we go.
So when the industry first started discussing about this move to IP, and you heard it today also, the COTS and the move to commercial off-the-shelf products, and oh my God, this is the beginning of the end for the traditional broadcast hardware manufacturers. They're going to be, you know, too expensive compared to these other options and these cheaper switches and what have you. What do you see as, you know, is that true? Could you ever see yourself, you know, moving to just a simple run down to the you know, Staples and buy a couple
I would say that COTS is a mythical unicorn. It does not exist. There's no such thing in this business.
How do you really feel? No, why do you say that?
Well, you know, if you know, with Evertz, you're buying an EXE switch, but even if you know, allow yourself to look elsewhere, you know, the hardware you need to buy from Cisco or Juniper or Arista is hardly COTS. You know, it's expensive stuff, and it's not something you're ever going to go get at Best Buy. So, you know, no matter how you slice it, you know, it's specialized, expensive hardware, and it's not getting cheaper.
Yeah, do you need, you know, what the manufacturers provide us is their expertise in the hardware that they provide. In a COTS solution, you're going down to the Best Buy and buying a switch, and it's an HP or a Cisco switch, you know, and you have a problem, you're gonna call up Cisco and be like, oh, I'm having this problem. They're gonna be like, who are you and why are you calling us? Right. So I think the expertise of the Evertz and the Grass Valleys and whoever else is making a router out there is going to be more valuable than anything, really.
Right.
And I'll just, you know, sort of springboarding on that a little bit. You know, one of the things that's, you know, been awesome in my career in the TV business is you up until very recently, you bought a router and you could understand it quickly and how to run it, and you didn't require a support team necessarily, you know, on call 24/7 just in case. And you could train someone to operate an SDI router, no big deal. You know, if it failed, it took, you know, little chunks of it out, and you could slap a new board in and have a nice day. That's just not the case now with the IP stuff. I'm not sure, one of the things that concerns me is I don't know if we're ever going to get back to the place where we just sort of go about our business without the direct assistance of our vendor, you know, pretty much full time.
Right.
I'm not sure we're ever going to get there again.
Is there any concern over, you know, having over network security? And, you know, you mentioned the Converge Networks. You know, you're adding more things into this network that you've heard this. I've heard grumblings. You know, someday someone's going to pop in and take over the Super Bowl truck, you know, 1 hour before showtime and say, hey, pay us $1 million, otherwise the Super Bowl is not going to happen. Any concerns about that?
In Encore, just for example, not a huge amount of concern. That network is pretty isolated. However, as you just mentioned, as we get into more converged networks, yeah, absolutely. That's, you know, just from the standpoint of some evildoer coming in to do something evil, you know, that's one thing to think about. The other thing is a bad actor, a bad piece of equipment that's a bad actor and really doing something it shouldn't be doing on the network, not necessarily intentionally, but flooding the network with bits and blowing something up. So you need a lot of intelligence in that central core to make sure that you don't have evildoers doing evil things or messed up equipment doing bad stuff.
I was at a session once on network security, and some gentleman was presenting about the training that they did at this company, and the next day there was a problem with the virus spreading throughout the whole entire company, and they ran into the person who did it, and they said, well, you didn't say anything about Facebook. So it's going to be interesting to see how this kind of all unwinds.
Yeah, it'll probably come down, I mean, it's always convenience versus security, right? So the higher the security, the more isolated we make it, the less convenience. So I think we're going to get a lot of pushback from clients because they all want this,
with the REMI stuff, and
you want it all combined, everything to talk. But the more you have on the network, the more you have talking together, the more chance you have for a security problem.
right,
So we'll find the balance.
right.
And the other thing too is, with respect to security, as we found, we're not so concerned with people getting into the switch and messing around with video, substituting video. That was a question someone asked. Could they substitute video on the output of the Super Bowl? And the answer was no, not really. But we need to make very sure that our command and control systems are pretty buttoned up. That are sitting on top of that.
Right, right. So last question from both of you. So advice on if someone hasn't made the leap, how should they go? What are the three questions they should be asking themselves as far as figuring out whether going IP is right for them?
Well, question number one, I think, is motivation. Why do you think you need to do that? For us, as I've said, the motivation was infrastructure size. We had to do it. And if I were doing it again today, without that as a motivator, I think I'd be wanting to, take a real close look at 2110 and make sure that the vendor I chose had demonstrated interoperability, and that really that investment was going to get me 10 years down the road.
Peter, as far as when you go on the show floor, how do you approach investigating IP routers at this point? Well,
I'll say when I'm talking to people, everybody seems pretty surprised that we're like, nope, we're not doing it right now. They're like, well, but that's the buzzword. That's what everybody's doing. And I said, well, why? I can understand why we're, if you're a new facility and you're redoing your facility and you want it to last for 20 years, then yeah, you need to jump in right now when you need to make that investment now. But with with the clients, they want the new stuff. So it's just not there yet for us. So I think I don't know. Everybody's surprised.
Well, are your clients asking for it? Are they saying
no? No, I don't.
Goes back to the 3G discussions, right? We want 3G so we can do 3D. And that,
right.
That one.
Yeah.
No, because you guys suffered a lot for that, right? I mean, that was not.
Well, 3G and 3D were, related to one another. They weren't necessarily required. But
or 1080p. People said 3G for 1080p broadcasting, which again that didn't happen either. So.
Yeah.
But if the client started asking for it, then you'd probably make the move, I guess, at
yes.
some point.
And really, the way the client asks for it is they say, I need to support 30 cameras and 15 12-channel EVSs and 40 seats of multi-viewers. That's how they make that ask. They don't know to say, I just think IP is cool, and that's what I want.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, guys. I think, obviously the discussion for this is just beginning, because I think to the point of today about this abstract, the next level of conversation in 2 or 3 years is about the virtual truck and, having the, just sort of like FPGAs field, everything's reprogrammed in the truck on a day-by-day basis, and there's going to be interesting learning as this all unwinds.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, a couple of years we'll be having a completely different conversation, but that's what makes this business fun.
Exactly. Great. Excellent. Well, thanks, guys, for your time.
Thank you.